There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that contains a phrase archaeologists cannot fully explain. Catalogue number K.8538, a celestial planisphere officially dated to 650 BCE, showing star positions over ancient Nineveh. Routine astronomical record, except for one detail that makes researchers pause. The tablet describes something that shouldn't appear in any ancient sky observation. A second luminous body beside the moon, moving against the fixed stars in a way planets don't move, bright enough to cast shadows, visible for hours before vanishing at dawn. Some say it records a comet, others say a fireball. A few claim it preserves memory of something older, something impossible. The night the second moon vanished. Consider the math. A Sumerian priest-scribe born in 3160 BCE who lived to 60, not unusual for temple class with access to clean water and grain reserves, would have died around 3100 BCE. That means he was 37 years old in 3123 BCE, fully trained, responsible for tracking lunar cycles and interpreting omens that determined whether the king prepared for assassination or invasion, whether the city stored extra grain against famine, whether the army marched or held position. Not astrology, operational intelligence. The old Babylonian lunar eclipse omen tablets reveal systematic pattern matching between celestial events and documented disasters spanning 2,000 years. The texts were maintained across institutional transitions, copied when tablets cracked, updated when new patterns were observed. If the moon appears blood red during eclipse, the omen specifies threat direction based on zodiac position. Eclipse in Nisanu, the spring month, predicts plague. Eclipse in Tashretu, autumn, predicts famine. These weren't suggestions, they were survival protocols. The British Museum holds fragment K.8538. Official catalogue entry identifies it as a celestial planisphere representing the night sky over Nineveh on January 3rd to 4th, 650 BCE. Mainstream archaeological consensus treats it as a routine observational record, one of thousands documenting systematic sky watching that Mesopotamian temples conducted for millennia. Then in 2008, everything fractured. University of Bristol researchers Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel published a hypothesis claiming the tablet recorded a catastrophic asteroid impact around 3123 BCE, connecting it to the Kofels landslide in Austria. The British Museum has not revised its catalogue entry. The 3123 BCE interpretation remains fringe. Academic Assyriology largely ignores it, but YouTube videos discussing Sumerian tablets and second moons accumulate 350,000 views. Another about the moon being artificially placed reaches 300,000 views. The audience wants this mystery. The question is whether the mystery exists in the ancient record or in modern projection onto texts we're still learning to decode. Here's what makes dismissal harder. Mesopotamian sky watchers tracked phenomena we can verify. They recorded the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle. They predicted eclipses accurately enough that kings postponed battles based on their calculations. They identified Venus's synodic period and Mars's retrograde motion centuries before Greek astronomy. The Mulapin tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE but drawing on observations centuries older, catalogue the rising and setting times of dozens of stars with accuracy that modern astronomers can confirm. When they wrote about the sky, they weren't guessing. So when a phrase appears describing something that doesn't match known astronomical phenomena, researchers face a choice. Either the ancient observer saw something we cannot explain, or the translation is wrong, or the phrase means something completely different in context we've lost. The phrase that keeps surfacing in fringe interpretations, sometimes attributed to K.8538 and sometimes to fragments whose catalogue numbers shift depending on the source, describes the moon appearing doubled. A second bright body moving near the moon in ways planetary conjunctions don't explain. Orthodox astronomy offers plausible explanations. A bright comet passing within degrees of the moon would appear as a distinct luminous body, not a streaking tail, but a circular glow similar in shape to the moon itself. Comet Hale-Bopp in 1997 was visible in daylight. Comet McNaught in 2007 cast shadows at night. A large bolide entering atmosphere at shallow angle can remain visible for minutes rather than seconds. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor lasted 30 seconds and caused eye injuries from brightness. Venus at maximum elongation, 47 degrees from the Sun, casts shadows and remains visible in daylight if you know where to look. None of these require lost moons or cosmic war. But here's what matters for understanding the terror. To a Sumerian priest-scribe in 3123 BCE, any of these explanations would mean the same thing: catastrophe. The sky was not entertainment, it was visible divine order. The moon's predictable cycles represented cosmic stability. Its phases governed the calendar, which governed planting, which governed survival. If the moon appeared to duplicate, if a second body moved against fixed stars in a way decades of training had never prepared him to witness, the implication wasn't curiosity. It was existential dread. The gods had broken their own pattern, not a lunar eclipse which the omen tables explained and predicted and assigned specific meaning, not a comet which temple tradition had catalogued as portent of war or plague, but at least accounted for. Something else. Something outside the entire inherited framework of interpretation that 800 years of observational records had built. He sat in the temple courtyard that night, clay tablet prepared, reed stylus in hand, watching the eastern horizon. The moon rose exactly where it should, and beside it, pale against the stars, something else appeared. It wasn't red like Mars. It wasn't the steady yellow-white of Venus at maximum brightness. The observer, whose name doesn't appear on any surviving fragment, wrote it in the conditional format all Mesopotamian omen texts follow. If the moon appears doubled, if a pale body moves beside the true moon against the fixed stars, if the second light vanishes before dawn, then the king will die within the year. Then flood comes from the north. Then harvest fails and granaries empty and the city falls. These weren't poetic warnings. They were operational predictions based on centuries of documented pattern matching between sky events and disasters. The scribe watched the pale body move, not like a planet following the ecliptic path, predictable months in advance, not like a star fixed relative to other stars as heaven's sphere rotates. This moved independently, crossing from one constellation to another in ways his training had never described. It cast a faint shadow. Anyone awake in the city below would have seen two moons in the sky. One real, one impossible, both visible to anyone awake in the streets below. He wrote the emergency omen on wet clay, not the formal tablet that would be fired and archived, clay that could be erased if his eyes had deceived him, if fatigue or lamplight or atmospheric distortion had created illusion. But the pale body remained. It brightened slightly as it moved westward. By the 4th hour of night it had crossed 3 constellations. By the 6th hour it slowed. Temple attendants woke and saw it. The palace was notified. Prayers began. Sacrifices were prepared. The city's grain reserves were inventoried in case the omen predicted famine. The king's guard was doubled in case it predicted assassination, and the priest-scribe kept writing, updating the record every hour, noting position relative to stars he had memorized since childhood, calculating trajectory, searching memory for historical precedent. There was none. The moon omen tablets archived in the temple library, copied from tablets going back 800 years, contained warnings about eclipses, blood-red moons, lunar halos during storms, the moon rising in wrong phase. They recorded what happened when 2 planets appeared in conjunction near the moon, when Jupiter approached within a degree of the lunar disk, when Saturn's rings caught unusual light. The compilers of those tablets had been thorough. They had catalogued every anomaly their predecessors had witnessed and assigned it a meaning, a prediction, a protocol. None mentioned duplication. None described a second body moving independently through night sky with brightness rivaling the true moon. By dawn, it was gone. The real moon set westward as it should. The pale body faded as the horizon brightened, not setting but dissipating, as if made of something less solid than rock and reflected light. The city survived that day. The king did not die. No flood came. The harvest months later was ordinary. But the phrase entered temple records. The night the second moon vanished. And for the rest of his life, the priest-scribe watched the sky with different attention, scanning the eastern horizon each night for the pale body, waiting to see if it would return, and whether this time he could name it. Here's where the investigation fractures into competing explanations. None provable, all plausible. Modern astronomy offers several candidates for what a trained observer in 3123 BCE might have witnessed and interpreted as a second moon. A bright comet with visible coma passing within degrees of the moon would appear as a distinct luminous body, not a tail streaking across sky, but a circular glow similar in shape to the moon itself. Comet brightness varies enormously. At perihelion, a major comet can outshine Jupiter and remain visible across multiple nights, tracing a slow arc relative to background stars that would look nothing like the steady planetary motion a trained skywatcher expected. A large bolide entering atmosphere at shallow angle can remain visible for minutes, burning brilliant white before fragmenting. A particularly brilliant Venus conjunction at maximum elongation, positioned near a thin crescent moon, might create an illusion of duplication to an observer expecting the moon to appear alone. None of these possibilities requires anything beyond ordinary celestial mechanics. All of them would have been, to the scribe watching that night, completely without precedent. The University of Bristol hypothesis, published in 2008 and widely circulated through press releases that generated hundreds of news articles, proposed something more dramatic. Researchers connected K.8538 star positions to June 29th, 3123 BCE, suggesting the tablet described an asteroid travelling across the sky before impacting near Kofels in the Austrian Alps. The press releases described the object as a kilometre-wide impactor travelling at hypersonic speed, generating a plasma fireball visible across the eastern Mediterranean. Mainstream geology attributes Kofels to a natural rock slide approximately 9,800 years ago, not an impact crater. The British Museum maintains its 650 BCE catalogue entry. Academic Assyriologists declined to engage the Bristol interpretation in peer-reviewed literature. But the press release reached YouTube. Videos discussing Sumerian tablets and second moons accumulated 350,000 views. The audience wants evidence that ancient witnesses saw something extraordinary. The question remains whether that something was fireball, comet, optical illusion, or mythologized memory of a mundane astronomical event that grew more dramatic with each retelling across generations until it became the night the second moon vanished. Atmospheric effects during major volcanic eruptions create lunar halos through ice crystals in the stratosphere refracting moonlight. To an observer unfamiliar with optics, a bright halo positioned beside the moon rather than around it might appear as a second luminous body. The eruption of a major volcano in the years around 3123 BCE, and geologists have identified candidates from ice core data, could have seeded the upper atmosphere with enough particulate to create persistent optical effects lasting weeks. Lunar eclipses combined with atmospheric dust create unusual coloration and brightness patterns that don't match standard blood-red appearance. A partial eclipse occurring simultaneously with rare atmospheric lensing could theoretically create the appearance of duplication, or the entire story might be later mythology. Bronze Age disaster narratives often attach themselves to real astronomical events that occurred decades or centuries earlier. A devastating flood in 3100 BCE might have been retroactively connected to an unusual sky event from 3123 BCE, with scribes generations later recording the connection as if the celestial omen had predicted disaster, when in reality the two events were unrelated and the connection was narrative construction, not observation. This kind of retroactive meaning-making wasn't deception. It was how ancient record-keeping systems maintained coherence. If the omen texts were to remain useful as survival protocols, they had to explain past disasters. Connecting unrelated events was a way of filling gaps in an interpretive framework that couldn't afford to admit uncertainty. Each explanation is plausible on its own. Together they form something harder to dismiss. The pattern that emerges isn't cover-up, it's knowledge loss through time and institutional collapse. We have K.8538. We don't have the context tablets that would have been archived alongside it, the companion records explaining what the main tablet referred to, the observational logs from the night in question, the follow-up entries noting whether the emergency predictions proved accurate. We don't have observational logs from other cities that night. A second observer stationed 200 miles away in Ur or Lagash would have seen the same sky. Their records, if they wrote them, haven't survived. We don't have follow-up records describing whether predicted disasters occurred. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE. Temple libraries burned. Thousands of tablets were lost. The ones that survived were buried in ash excavated 2,000 years later, catalogued by scholars who couldn't have known which fragments were routine star maps and which were anomaly reports. The priest-scribe who wrote the original observation, if he wrote it in 3123 BCE, and if K.8538 actually records that event rather than a 650 BCE star map as official catalogues maintain, is dead. His students are dead. Their students are dead. The oral tradition that would have explained what the phrase meant, what he actually saw, whether it returned, whether the omens proved accurate, whether other cities recorded something similar that night. All that context died within a few generations. What survives is the formal record, stripped of the informal commentary that would have travelled alongside it in conversation, in teaching, in the accumulated memory of a temple institution that no longer exists. He would have been an old man by the time the city fell, if he lived that long. Temple scribes who survived childhood typically reached their 60s or 70s. He might have watched the sky every night for 30 years, waiting to see if the pale body returned, training students to recognize signs, updating omen tablets with new entries. If the moon appears doubled and the second body moves against fixed stars, then what? He never finished the prediction because the disaster he feared never came, or it came in a form he didn't recognize, or it came so gradually no one connected it to that night. The students he trained would have inherited the unfinished entry. They might have tried to complete it, matching later disasters to the original observation, constructing the causal chain their teacher had left open. Or they might have flagged it as unresolved, a category without precedent, and preserved it alongside completed omens as an acknowledgement that the system had encountered something it couldn't fully explain. He died. The temple archived his tablets. The city survived for decades, maybe centuries. Other scribes copied his records without understanding them, preserving words because preservation was their job, not because they knew what the words meant. The records travelled from institution to institution as cities rose and fell, copied into new collections, catalogued under new systems. The city eventually fell, as all Bronze Age cities did, conquered or abandoned or destroyed by flood or earthquake or the slow economic collapse that ended the Bronze Age across the eastern Mediterranean. The tablets were buried. They survived 5,000 years in the ground, more durable than the palace, more durable than city walls, more durable than the temple itself. Austin Henry Layard excavated them in 1851, pulling fragments from the ash and rubble of Nineveh in a dig that was simultaneously archaeology and salvage operation. The British Museum catalogued them, scholars translated them. George Smith, working in the British Museum's collection in 1872, identified the flood narrative embedded in the Gilgamesh tablets, and made international news. More translations followed. More fragments were identified, cross-referenced, matched to companion pieces. And somewhere in that archive of thousands of fragments, maybe in K.8538, or maybe in a fragment whose catalogue number shifts depending on which researcher cites which interpretation, the phrase remains. The night the second moon vanished, we have the words, we have the fear, we have testimony from a trained observer who spent his life tracking celestial patterns and saw something that violated every pattern he knew. We don't have the sky that night. We cannot reconstruct what he saw with certainty. Astronomy can model planetary positions, eclipses, comet orbits if we know which comet, but it cannot replay atmospheric effects, volcanic halos, or bolides whose trajectories were never recorded. What we have is a witness who knew the sky better than almost anyone alive at that moment, reporting an anomaly in the only language his civilization had built for anomalies, conditional omens predicting disaster. The tablet preserves what the witness couldn't finish explaining. Archives remember even when we've forgotten how to read them. The question the tablet encodes outlasted the institution that wrote it, the city that housed it, and the civilization that built both. And 5,000 years later, on the other side of every intervening civilization, we're still asking the same question he asked that night, stylus in hand, watching something impossible move across the sky. What am I seeing? The answer died with him. The question survived. It always does.